Good evening, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Capitalist Cast. This evening, we're actually being joined by Linda Kerns. Linda actually has several different hats that she's wearing. So we're going to try and take the hats one at a time. The first one, which was really interesting, and I mean, it must have been a fascinating experience, is that you were an attorney for the Trump campaign as the lawsuits and everything were being brought related to the 2020 elections. Can you talk a little bit about what your role was there and what that experience was like?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, Leo. Thank you for having me. I'll talk about election law anytime, anywhere. So I'm happy to be here. I've actually been an election law lawyer here in Philadelphia for 20 years. I've represented campaigns, candidates, voters, political parties, foundations on all aspects of election law. And the Trump campaign actually hired me in September for this election. I had represented the Trump campaign back in 2016 too. And the reason they originally hired me was because of the satellite election offices.
Right.
What had happened here in Pennsylvania is Mark Zuckerberg, through a charity, had rained millions and millions of dollars down on Pennsylvania, but most of it concentrated in the blue counties. And Philadelphia used their money to open up what they called satellite election offices. And the Trump campaign's issue was people were voting in there. And if people were voting in there, we wanted our poll watchers in there to watch what was going on. So that's why I got hired.
Yeah, and I mean, that was a really interesting case because the issue of satellite offices, as well as the issue of like drop boxes and stuff like that, weren't, as I understand it, weren't actually written into the Act 77, what became Act 77.
Absolutely not.
It was invented by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Well, before the Supreme Court invented it, the Secretary of State and the county election offices invented it. What they did was they took two parts of the election code. One part that says that a county can set up offices, and another part that says that voters can drop off their mail-in ballots at the election office, and they basically combined those two parts and then came up with this concept called satellite election offices, where here in Philadelphia, they opened them at some schools and some gymnasiums, like some large facilities where there was plenty of room. And, we didn't really have a lot of notice that this was happening. And basically the first day, people from the campaign, went to these offices, and we talked to the people who were running them and said, hey, can we come in? Isn't there voting going on? And the first guy we talked to wasn't really sure. And he had to call his legal counsel. And then we spoke with Commissioner Al Schmidt, who's one of the commissioners here in Philadelphia. And he also had to call his attorney when our guy asked him whether voting was going on, which I thought was kind of funny because he's elected to run voting. So I would think you wouldn't have to call your attorney to ask what voting is. And he came back and said, it's not actually voting because the vote is not being recorded. So you can't come in. And the Trump campaign was not happy about that. Elections should be transparent. I wrote a letter to the city commissioners, and the day that I did that, Trump was actually in a debate, and that's my letter was why he said bad things happen in Philadelphia,
right? Because
he knew about the satellite election offices.
Yeah, and this isn't the first time or the first issue where the PA Supreme Court has really done some questionable things as it relates to election law, and unfortunately, I mean, we hear kind of perennial complaints. Particularly from election facilities in Philadelphia about observer access and just being able to having independent people or, folks from the campaign being able to actually observe what's happening. Not necessarily, they're not there to try and impact what people are doing, but just to be able, even as it relates to counting, being able to get into buildings. So I mean, this is a little bit nuanced when it came to whether or not how whether or not you were able to go in and actually observe, how did the courts actually find and what happened with that? Because I mean, we saw that they didn't, but what was the logic behind it?
Right. Well, I sued at the common pleas level, and the judge there basically said that it's not an actual polling place. The legislature did not call this a polling place. And what was kind of ironic about it was everyone from the committee of 70 to the governor to the attorney general to the election officials, they were all tweeting out, "Come vote at the satellite election offices," and they were putting pictures up, "Come and vote," and people had it all over Facebook. I voted today at a satellite election office. And then when I sued and pointed that out in my exhibits, they did stop that, and they stopped calling it voting. They called it dropping off your ballot. I lost at the common pleas level, and then that got appealed to the Commonwealth Court, which is the next court up. And unfortunately, that there was a 3-judge panel. 1 judge found for us, 2 found against us, so that was a loss. We actually did not bring that case to the Supreme Court, only because the election then was in a few days, and the satellite election offices would close anyway, and we moved on to other things. So.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because it shows a couple of different things. I mean, just kind of as an outside observer, a non-legal observer, it really shows that if the General Assembly is not very specific in how they word things, it really allows for both the executive branch and the judiciary to take make some pretty questionable choices about how they're interpreting the law.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I think people don't always think about is what makes our country great, and that's separation of powers. We have an executive, a judiciary, a legislative branch. They should all stay in their own lanes, and that's what makes it work. And what we found in this election is we had the judges, virtually, almost every judge that was looking at this in Pennsylvania, the state court judges, they were interpreting, rewriting. Even when they saw the word "shall," they were kind of combining it with other phrases and saying maybe that's not what the legislature meant. And honestly, there was very few judges who actually, did what they were supposed to do. One was one judge who issued a great opinion out on the west side of the state was Judge Kevin Brobson. He's the president judge of the Commonwealth Court.
Right.
And right in his opinion, he said, judges cannot rewrite laws. And then he actually just, another thing people might not understand, election law happens 365 days a year. I know the Trump campaign, that was very exciting, but I do election law every day of the year. And there was just some ballot challenges, and Judge Brobson just issued another opinion. And he actually wrote in his opinion, I have it right here on my desk, he wrote, "Shall means shall" about signatures. And as an attorney, that is so refreshing to read, because then the judge is actually interpreting the law as the legislature wrote it, and you can give confidence to your clients that, hey, this is what a judge is going to do. Unfortunately, judges like Kevin Brobson are few and far between. So we're lucky to have them.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good point. And actually, talking about the fact that election law happens 365 days a year is really a great segue into the other issue that I wanted to bring up with you. You were involved as an attorney for the Public Interest Law Foundation.
Public Interest Legal Foundation. Right?
Sorry, Public Interest Legal Foundation. My apologies. You and the organization just had a really, at the beginning of April, had a really fascinating settlement, a really important settlement with the Pennsylvania Department of State as it relates to dead people on Pennsylvania's election on the books. Could
Absolutely.
You tell us a little bit about that lawsuit and what ended up happening? And as I mean, it's just a fascinating thing to hear about.
Sure. The Public Interest Legal Foundation, and you can read all about them, publicinterestlegal.org. That's a public interest law firm. There's not many like it in the country, and it's the only one of its kind dedicated to election integrity and making sure voter rolls are kept clean. The president of that foundation is J. Christian Adams. I met J. Christian Adams long ago in Philadelphia. I think it was 2008 when we had that issue with the Black Panthers outside the polling place, guarding the polling place. So J. Christian Adams and I have known each other since then, and I am the Pennsylvania counsel to that organization. And what the Public Interest Legal Foundation does is we look at the voter rolls. We look at public records. We get the voter rolls, and we compare them to public records. And under a statute called the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, we are permitted to ask these various secretaries of state, hey, show us what you're doing to maintain the rolls. And we did that with Pennsylvania. We saw because we compared the Pennsylvania voter rolls to a lot of public data that we located at least 21,000 what it looked like deceased registrants. And what people need to understand is we were only looking at people whose birth dates happened greater than 65 years ago. So it's not even we at that point we weren't even looking at everybody. And we advised Pennsylvania that we had this issue. They didn't respond. We sued in October. Unfortunately, that we sued in federal court. The judge did not address it prior to the election, but after the election, we came to a settlement. And not only did Pennsylvania, agree to remove dead registrants, they agreed to, keep up with it, and they paid some of our attorney's fees. So that was a huge win. And that's what election law is. It's like there's all sorts of pieces of the puzzle, and keeping voter rolls clean, especially now that we have this mail-in voting, is one of the most important things you can do for election integrity.
Yeah, and what gets lost is we have a system in Pennsylvania that has the responsibility for maintaining voter rolls essentially split between the state level with the Department of State and then the county election boards. So what is this settlement actually? So this settlement in particular is with the Pennsylvania Department of State. What are they going to do with their voter data? How are they going to approach this?
Right. So we brought to their attention that they have this issue, and we pointed out the people that we found, and they agreed to review their own roles. And you're right, the Secretary of State has a duty to basically transmit that data to the counties, and they agreed to follow up with the counties on those issues. But you brought up a great point, because I have another lawsuit right now against Pennsylvania with the Public Interest Legal Foundation, and it's over non-citizens on the voter rolls. And I just deposed someone from the Secretary of State, and sometimes their answer is, well, that's the county job, and then the county people say, well, that's the state job. And that's part of what the Public Interest Legal Foundation does. We point out that the federal law, the National Voter Registration Act, says ultimately the buck stops with the Secretary of State, so you got to get it done.
Yeah, and I think that the finger pointing, and I mean, that's obviously, it's not something that's limited to election law. The wherever and whenever possible, different branches of government will point the finger at somebody else and claim that it's their responsibility. So I think that what you were able to accomplish is really fascinating, because the media generally presents this as no, there aren't any problems with the voter rolls. This is made up. This is a non-issue. But here, you found through some data mining, at least 21,000 people. And that's, as you mentioned, just over the age of 65. So the Department of State, as I understand it, is going to have to compare or look at the data that they're able to glean or access from the federal government and a consortium of other states. How are they going to compare the records?
Right. So that's a system that's called ERIC. And so they agreed to use that system to compare the records, the Social Security death index, and then the other publicly available records. And, when we were looking into that, some of those people with those that were on the voter rolls that we showed were deceased, not only did they have voting credits after the date of their death, some of them, it looked like they were enrolled after the date of their death. And, you bring up a point about how the media approaches this. And I know that a lot of times what I get from traditional media is, well, you can't prove it changed the election. And, how do you know? Because we don't know. This is just one piece of the puzzle. And here we are in an odd year when we have local elections, and some of those elections are won by just a couple votes. So, all those people who say, well, oh, wow, this won't change the election, they don't know that. And this is just one piece of the puzzle that really needs to be looked at, along with all the other issues that we have with voter integrity.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because as we take a look at, I know that, and I'm sure it's something that you're following, the Pennsylvania House, the State Government Committee, as well as some other committees in the Senate and kind of intergovernmental committees are really looking broadly at the election law, not just as it relates to the problems that came up in 2020, but in order to take care of some of these issues with inconsistency between counties in what the standards actually are, to make sure that things are spelled out much more clearly. As you look at what things are kind of under consideration, is there anything that jumps out at you as this is something, and I mean, everybody always points to things like voter ID and some of these big ticket items, which are really important, but are there things that the General Assembly should be looking at, not just as it relates to the 2020 election, but overall, when they're trying to figure out how to reform this so people can have confidence in the outcome of the elections?
Well, I think the flow of outside money into these elections is a big problem, especially, and we have a piece on Broad and Liberty about this, especially when, it was sprinkled in the counties that vote red, but really it was, a deluge in the counties that vote blue, and that's a problem. What came up with the new law, the mail-in balloting law, is that the counties, interpreted things so loosely. We had these ballot drop boxes in Philadelphia, right, and they were a big problem. Number one, who knows what the chain of custody was? There was really no security. The Trump campaign, we had somebody filming when we could some of the boxes, and our guy was standing behind the news guy, the guy from ABC News and the guy from the New York Times, and it was, so we were filming, and they were taking pictures, and their pictures ended up on the news or in the New York Times or in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a couple of the pictures, had a heading where, Trump campaign gets their hand slapped for filming the ballot boxes, and I just thought, well, how could we get our hand slapped when we were standing behind the news guy? You're out in public. So, I think that that's a big issue. Another big issue, and this was absolutely heartbreaking to me during the election, was different counties in Pennsylvania treated the ballots differently. If you lived in Philadelphia, we had some of our election commissioners Facebook messaging you and saying, hey, your ballot came back and you didn't fill it out correctly. You better come correct it. Whereas other counties looked at the law that says that you're supposed to take the ballots and put them in a safe place until they're canvassed, which is on election day, didn't touch the ballots. So those people did not have a chance to what's called cure the problems with their mail-in ballots, whereas other counties did. And that's just not fair. And I talked to some people, who said they really wanted to vote in this election, and they found out later their vote was canceled and they had no chance to cure it. Now, I personally don't think you should have a chance to cure it. I think that, once you do it, just like when you go to a voting booth. But my bigger issue is have it the same in every county. If you're going to allow curing in Philadelphia, allow curing in other counties. And frankly, I don't know how you could possibly do that fairly, because you could never reach everybody who makes a problem.
Right. So is that, on the issue of curing ballots, just as an example, is that something where the law wasn't written with enough specificity, or is that something where it was just kind of judicial interpretation? Or how did we get to a situation where we have such vastly different standards that these county organizations are following?
Right. Well, I mean, I thought the law was pretty clear. It said that the voter must fill out, date, and sign. And to me, that sounds pretty clear. That I don't hear a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
Fill out, date, and sign. And I argued in front of judges that said that's not clear. And they kind of came up with all these excuses. Well, they really wanted you to date and sign, but did they really want you to fill out? So what was happening was a lot of these counties were counting ballots, some that weren't completely filled out. Might have just had a signature and a date, but the voter didn't write their address out. And when you think about it, the mail-in balloting, what they try to do is mimic what happens when you go to the voting booth in as much as you can, the same formalities. You go to the voting, wherever you vote, and they ask you your name, you sign in, the person, looks at you, then you go into the voting booth and you vote for whoever you want to vote. So the mail-in procedure tries to mimic that to some extent. You fill out your ballot, you put it in the secrecy envelope, you shut it, and you put it in the regular envelope, and then you fill it out, date and sign. And those types of, procedures, formalities give some security and give some assurance that the person who's filling it out is the person who is the voter. Unfortunately, in this election, for reasons that I don't understand, they decided that you were not allowed to compare signatures. So that was even taken away. Yeah.
And not to, I want to jump back quick to the settlement, because I had a couple of questions when I was reading it, and maybe I wasn't reading it correctly.
Sure.
So when I took a look at it, what in the agreement requires the Department of State to continue this process in the future? So we don't end up with 21,000 dead people allegedly on the rolls in the future. Like, what is going to require them to continue to monitor the situation and provide updates on a regular basis?
Okay, well, what they agreed to was updates to us over a certain time period. So this settlement doesn't say that they have to report to us forever. But what continues is the actual NVRA, the federal law. And when we get settlements like this, and when we're successful like this, and we're successful all over the country, not just Pennsylvania, but then they know that we're coming next time, because as soon as the year is over, and we're just going to keep watching, and they know that we're coming back. So that having eyes on it and forcing this transparency is something that will keep them honest.
So it's mostly the sunlight aspect of it that
Absolutely.
This is a case that has already been settled. This is they were already told and agreed to do something. So in the future, it just makes it that much more likely for them to do it or to maintain that.
Absolutely. And as part of the settlement, I'm looking at it now. They do have to provide us with certain information over a period of time. But yeah, you're right. It's not forever, and frankly, no one would. They wouldn't agree to that anyway, and a judge probably wouldn't order that either. But this does keep them honest. And believe me, the Public Interest Legal Foundation is not going away. If anything, we're getting a lot stronger. So, and if a year or two goes by and we find the same problems, I don't think the court's going to be too happy that they found themselves in that situation again.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think that just kind of having that scrutiny and making sure that sunlight is, on the issue is important. The other item that I noticed, so we mentioned earlier that the counties have a role in maintaining the voter rolls, and the state has a role in maintaining the voter rolls. So as I understand it, as I read this, the state is going to take the information that they get from Eric. They're going to transmit it to the counties, and the counties are then going to compare it to what's on their records and everything like that. I guess my question was, in the law, in the settlement, it notes, specifically that the counties are not obligated to to do anything as it relates to the settlement. So, what do you see happening? If you send, if the Department of State sends, 5,000 names to Philadelphia as being, folks who are appearing on a deceased list, and the city of Philadelphia doesn't actually do anything with that data, what's the next step? Is it another lawsuit to force Philadelphia to comply with it? How does that work? Because we do have that bifurcated system.
Right. Well, under the NVRA, there's a procedure, and first what happens is we would send a letter to Philadelphia asking for what's called their list maintenance efforts, their list maintenance procedures. And if they respond, that's great. We look at it, make sure they did what they were supposed to do. And if they don't, we sue. And in our experience, unfortunately, they don't always respond. In fact, it's more likely that they won't respond. So it probably would be another lawsuit. But you know what? These lawsuits, they can be expensive for the counties, and it's not the best publicity to know that
Right.
They're not retaining, maintaining their voter rolls. And people like you highlighting it that helps. That's great, and we want to get the word out. I actually wrote about this at Broad and Liberty. I wrote a piece about this.
And that is the segue into your last hat that I wanted to talk to you about.
Great.
So, I mean, that was perfect. So I actually found the information out about this settlement from Broad and Liberty.
Great.
There was very little media coverage. I mean, basically no media coverage of this settlement outside of the Washington Examiner, from what I could find. So you are a co-founder of Broad and Liberty. Explain what that is for everybody who's watching.
Right. So I am an attorney in Philadelphia, and occasionally I do like to write opinion pieces. And what started to happen is, publications like the Philadelphia Inquirer, traditional newspapers, they just basically stopped taking any opinion pieces that were, center, right of center, libertarian. And it's really frustrating because, you can't get your voice out there. And we came together. There was 5 of us that came together and said, you know what, can we do something else? Can we start a place, a media site where, we can have these conversations. We can have these difficult conversations. We can bring up things without, like they say today, getting canceled. So we started September of 2019. Our opening day was actually September 17th, which is the Constitution's birthday. So it was really important to me that we opened that day. And it was, I'm on the executive committee of the Federalist Society, which is another public policy group, and I was able to have John Yoo write for us, who's, he was in the Bush administration, and he writes all the time about liberty and so forth. And we just went off to just a running start, and now we're a place that you can read about other viewpoints. And here in Philadelphia, I really was not able to write while I was representing Trump. I wasn't doing any media whatsoever. But prior to that, here in Philadelphia, we had a problem with something called safe injection sites, where a group decided, they would set up a site where people could come and ingest drugs. And our U.S. attorney at the time, Bill McSwain, he said, you know what, this is against the law. And he sued. He sued in district court, and I wrote a lot about that for Broad and Liberty. And I ended up on the Laura Ingraham show, and that suit actually, while the U.S. attorney lost at the district court level, he won at the appellate court level. So for right now, we have no safe injection sites here in Philadelphia, and we can thank Bill McSwain for that. And another thing that I've written a lot about is just crime. We have a real crime problem here in Philadelphia, and we had a case where a mom, Linda Skellinger, lost her son to what was essentially a murder. And from her perspective, and a lot of people's perspective, it was the district attorney's fault that the person who perpetrated that crime, was not held accountable. And I interviewed her, and I wrote a lot about that. And I write about, other just the rising crime and the real problems that we have in Philadelphia. But there's all sorts of great pieces on Broad and Liberty. So I encourage everybody to check it out.
Yeah, it has been a fantastic. I mean, I appreciate it. I've subscribed. I get like your daily and weekly updates and everything like that, just to keep track, because it really is difficult to find information. The most major media, as you mentioned, they're not publishing, right of center libertarian positions.
Absolutely not. And it's this whole cancel culture, and I actually suffered from that when I represented Trump. It was amazing. I thought I was doing election law, and to some people, election law can be pretty boring when you're arguing over what does fill out, date, and sign mean. And when my name got out there, all of a sudden my phones were just inundated, my email, people were writing stuff about me on the internet. People went to my house. I was getting death threats, all because people didn't like that I was representing Trump. And I think that type of suppression or attempts to suppress people, you can see that in the media, and that we shouldn't have that. I mean, that's not what this country was founded on. People should have opinions and should be able to have different viewpoints and should be able to, robustly argue about them. That's how we learn about each other, and that's how we improve ourselves.
Yeah, it's definitely, we need to make sure that we are keeping the civil in civil society.
Absolutely. There should be room for debate. You should be allowed to say something. You should be able to voice an opinion without hearing that it's triggering somebody or that's too upsetting for somebody to hear. That's not how we improve as a society. And, hearing what other people have to say, that really is what makes us stronger.
Absolutely. And I think that is a fantastic place to end our conversation. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. I know that you are incredibly busy. And I am going to look forward to hopefully having you on again. I'd love to pick your brain once the legislature gets to work on releasing what their plan is for some election reform, just to hear what you have to say about what ultimately happens.
Right. And we have some, now we have municipal elections this year, and we have judicial elections, which are incredibly important. And for whatever reason, people don't show up for those. And I think it's important, like you show up for those and cast your vote. Next year, we have senator and governor. So, I'll be writing about it. I'll probably be representing a lot of those candidates. And if you go to my Twitter, Linda Kerns Law, LindaKerns LAW, I usually post, when I write about something or, a good case that I have, just to kind of keep people up to date.
Well, I'm definitely, I'm going to have to add you on Twitter, because the work that you're doing is it's phenomenal. I mean, I'm definitely a nerd when it comes to election law and this kind of stuff, just because it's so vital to a healthy and vibrant democracy. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. And again, thank you very much for coming on this evening. And I definitely look forward to having you on again.
Well, thank you. I think election integrity preserves our freedom, and we live in the greatest country in the world, and I want to keep it that way.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great night.
Good night.